Hi, so today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite decks of all time in GOAT format, and that is Reasoning Gate. Um, I'm going to go through the deck list. I'm going to describe or explain why I've chosen to play some of the cards that I'm playing here and the ratios that I'm playing them in. I'm going to talk about some pros and cons of the deck, and then I'll talk about some tips and tricks for playing and playing against the deck, like what to side in, etc. This is going to be kind of a longer video. It's meant to be like an in-depth deck profile slash tutorial video because I feel like this deck is often misunderstood both by people who are playing it and playing against it. And I feel like I play this deck in a particular way that maybe not everyone else plays in. So I kind of want to describe it. Starting us off, I'll explain like the main point of the deck and the deck's win condition. So the main point of the deck is to use Monster Gate and Reasoning. Actually, first I'll go through the card choices and then I'll describe what the deck does. So first you're playing a BLS, 3 Chaos Sorcerers, Demock, Fusilier, Air Knight, Jinzo, 2 Sacred Cranes, Sinister Serpent, 3 Dimension Fusions, 3 Monster Gates, 3 Reasonings. These are the most some of the most important spells in the deck. Staples, Graceful Charity, Pot of Greed, Snatch, Premature, Heavy, Double Trunade, 3 Scapegoats, 3 Metas, Lightning Vortex, Monster Reincarnation, Brain Control, Call, and 3 Raigeki Breaks. So as I was saying before, the main point of the deck is to use Monster Gate and Reasoning. Let me read those real quick. So Monster Gate, tribute 1 monster, excavate cards from the top of your deck until you excavate a monster that could be normal summoned or set. So that means just pick up cards on the top of your deck and send them to the graveyard until you hit a monster that could be normal summoned or set, and then you special summon that monster. Reasoning is similar. You also excavate cards on the top of your deck, except your opponent calls a level from 1 to 12, and if they call that number right, then the first monster that you can normal summon or set, it gets sent to the graveyard, and if they call it incorrectly, you get to special summon that card, like similar to Monster Gate. So say you activate Reasoning and your opponent calls 8. You keep milling cards from the top of your deck until you hit a monster that could be normal summoned or set, and say that monster was Dark Magician of Chaos. Since it is level 8 and they called level 8, then Demock gets sent to the graveyard. If they called 4 and you milled Demock, then you get to special summon this card. So you use these cards, power cards, basically to get out these big monsters or these monsters from your deck. The best card to hit is Dark Magician of Chaos. If you don't know what this does, anytime it is normal or special summoned, you can add a spell from your graveyard to your hand, which is sick. You can get any spell from your graveyard back to your hand. So you can see the deck is mostly spells and very few monsters. So usually when you use Monster Gate and Reasoning, you're going to be milling a ton of spells and traps until you hit a monster, and you're only running 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 monsters that could be special summoned off of Gate or Reasoning. BLS and Chaos Sorcerer, they all cannot be normal summoned, so if you excavate any of these, they'll go directly to the graveyard and kind of be skipped over until you hit one of these other 7 monsters. So the goal is to mill a lot of spells and then hit Demock, choose any spell in your graveyard to get back to your hand. Usually for the OTK, you're going to get Dimension Fusion. You also need one of these Chaos monsters to banish other monsters in your grave. So say you banish Jinzo and Sacred Crane with Chaos Sorcerer, then you can use Dimension Fusion, which says pay 2,000 life points, and both players special summon as many of their removed from play monsters as possible. So if you have Jinzo and Crane banished, you'll get them back with Dimension Fusion. And the goal is basically to spam the field with monsters and OTK your opponent. Another really cool interaction, which makes this deck really pretty sacky, is that Demock, whenever it leaves the field, it gets banished. So if it gets destroyed by battle or destroyed by card effect, or even if you use Metamorphosis on it, it's going to be banished, and then it's you can bring it back with Dimension Fusion, which is pretty sick. So a lot of times, the situation you'll find yourself in is that you already have Dark Magician of Chaos banished, and you can summon a Chaos monster by removing a light and dark, and then activate Dimension Fusion, and then all of a sudden you have 4 big monsters on the field. So that's basically how the deck OTKs, like its main win condition. I've built the deck in a way that is a little bit more grindy and a little bit less delicate. Some people will play like triple Jar of Greed, maybe Reckless Greed, maybe Upstart Goblin, and build it in more of a turbo way to try to win as fast as possible. And I've noticed that, like, even when you do play it that way, 1, it's a lot more delicate, and then 2, it usually takes like 2 or 3 turns to actually kill your opponent anyway. And if you build it a little bit more delicate like that, it's harder to play through, like a lot of traps, for example, or it's harder to out your opponent's board. So I've built it in a way that's a little bit more grindy and a little bit more like robust. Some of the card choices I want to highlight here. I think this one probably sticks out pretty hard if you're familiar with this deck at all. I'm playing triple Raigeki Break and Sinister Serpent. Most people will see the Sinister Serpent and just like immediately laugh because it's not a good target to hit off of Monster Gate or Reasoning. Or people don't think it's a good target to hit off of Monster Gate and Reasoning. Usually you want to aim to get out a big monster like one of these guys with your Monster Gate or Reasoning. But I'm playing Sinister Serpent because after playing this deck for a long time, I realized that this deck is really fragile to Delinquent Duo, which a lot of combo decks are. But if your opponent duos you on the first turn, which has been happening to me literally like 50% of all games I play, then it really does hurt this deck quite a bit more than other decks. So Sinister Serpent is good because it obviously makes the deck less fragile to duo. But then this deck actually like utilizes Sinister Serpent, I think, better than almost any other deck. The 2 other decks that would use it really well are obviously like Chaos Turbo or Go Control, or any kind of control deck really. Chaos Turbo because they usually play discard spells like Raigeki Break or Phoenix Wing and Blast. So it just serves as good this card. So it just serves as good discard fodder for those cards. But I feel like it's really, really important in this deck because this deck can struggle if it gets behind. And Sinister Serpent just serves as like a recurring resource that you can always just get back to your hand. And that's really important for this deck because you're playing Monster Gate. So having a normal summonable monster that you can have as a resource to tribute for Monster Gate is really, really important for this deck. You don't want to be in a situation where you're top decking Monster Gates with nothing to tribute. And Sinister Serpent helps that problem out. And then also, obviously, with Metamorphosis, just being able to always have a Metamorphosis target is sick. And then the deck also just plays a whole bunch of other discard cards. So in total, you're playing 3 Gates, 3 Metamorphoses, Lightning Vortex, Monster Reincarnation, 3 breaks. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 discard cards that really use Sinister Serpent effectively. And if you get Reasoning or Monster Gate, or if you get Sinister Serpent off of Gate or Reasoning early on, like turn 1 or 2, like it just has so much value for the deck. It's like insane. So yeah, that's why I chose to play Sinister. And there's actually 2 other reasons why I play Sinister. Firstly, this deck doesn't really have a good first turn. It's generally like you need to be going second to attack, obviously, right? So you can't OTK your opponent on the first turn. So this deck has a really lackluster first turn because you don't really want to be using Monster Gate or Reasoning just on your first turn. I'll talk more about this later. but it just leaves your monster out there and you can't attack with it, and your opponent can take it with Snatch Steal or Thousand Eyes. And Sinister Serpent kind of makes the deck a little bit better first turn, because if you hit it off of Gate or Reasoning first turn, it's just a solid card because you have a body on the field. If your opponent kills it, it'll come back. So that's another reason. And then the last reason I play it is obviously to synergize with the Raigeki Breaks. This deck can struggle against face downs quite a bit, like flip effect monsters. It doesn't really have a good way to deal with them because it doesn't main deck Nobleman of Crossout, and I don't main deck Nobleman because it will remove from play your opponent's monster and any other copies they have in their deck. So if you hit a Dekoichi and they're playing 3 of them, then that removes from play all 3 Dekoichis. Or if they're playing Gravekeeper Spy, if I could spell, if they're playing 2 or 3 of them, it'll remove these from play as well. And then when you use Dimension Fusion, you have to note that this actually lets your opponent special summon all of their removed from play monsters as well. So they'll get those back, right? And then they have 3 cards on the field. If they're Spy, they have 2,000 body walls on the field that'll be hard to get over. Or the Dekoichi, that's like 4,200 damage for them. So like Nobleman is not particularly, or like a lot worse in this deck than it is in other decks. So this deck generally struggles with face downs, Chaos Turbo. If they get the ball rolling with their Spies and Dekoichis early on fast, then it's kind of hard to keep up with them. So Raigeki Break helps with that problem because you can obviously use it to destroy their face downs. And then also it's just a chainable trap. I choose not to main things like Torrential or Mirror Force because they're like susceptible to things like obviously, like, you can't chain Torrential to MST or Heavy, and Mirror is just like a target for Breaker or other spell and trap removal. But Raigeki Break is pretty versatile, and it's chainable, obviously. It goes well with Sinister, but probably the second most important reason, or maybe the most important reason to play this card, other than dealing with face downs or just any threat, is that it helps you manipulate your hand. A lot of times with this deck, you will need just one more light or just one more dark in the graveyard to OTK your opponent, and you'll have like Demok in hand or Jinzo in hand or Sacred Crane in hand, and no way to get it into the graveyard. And that will often be the difference between like winning and losing that game. So Raigeki Break just lets you manipulate your hand whenever you want and control what's in your grave so that you can banish them for your chaos monsters. So yeah, that pretty much covers Raigeki Break and Sinister. I started playing this card, and I used to play this deck without it, and I really, really love it. It makes like Graceful better, obviously. It makes deck, a little bit better against Duo and the other reasons I explained. And just having that recurring resource every turn, it makes this deck a lot better in my opinion. Next, I'm playing 3 Metamorphosis. Some people play none, possibly. Some people play 2. I think that you have to play 3 in this deck. I really, really think you have to play 3 in this deck. Obviously, it's good with Scapegoat that you're playing 3 of. And by the way, you're playing Scapegoat because 1, it helps you stall. 2, the Scapegoat tokens serve as fodder for Monster Gate, which is really good. So the meta obviously goes well with the Scapegoats, but meta is really, really important in this deck. It's important in this deck for the same reason I was just describing with Raigeki Break. It lets you manipulate the lights and darks that you have in your graveyard, right? If you have a Crane in the field, you can meta it to instantly get a light in the grave, and maybe you go for Darkfire, which is a dark, and that already puts you in a position where you're going to have a light and dark in the grave for your chaos monsters. And then also, you can use it on really any card in the deck. Which brings me to another pro of this deck. If you haven't already gotten, the deck is an OTK deck. It's like really satisfying just to OTK your opponent, so that's like a pro. But another pro of this deck is that you have access to like all of the good fusion monsters in the format, like literally every single one, every single relevant fusion monster. And this deck is making like multiple fusions per game, more so than any other deck, which is why I find this deck so fun to play. Like you're making Thousand Eyes, Gatling Dragon, you're making this pretty often with DMOC. King Dragoon, you can make this with Fusilier. You can make these 6s, right, because you're playing Jinzo. You can make these 5s because you're playing Air Knight. So you can very easily make all of the relevant fusion cards in Go format, which I think is just like a really fun, unique aspect of the deck. So having the meta and the flexibility to meta your cards into whatever you need for that situation is just like a really important reason why you should play Metamorphosis. And then another reason that it's really important is because you can kind of loop DMOC. If you have, like, for example, if you have one or multiple metas in your hand and your opponent has a big field, you can meta for Gatling Dragon and try to pop their cards. And if you're not able to pop all of their cards with Gatling Dragon, you can just defusion your DMOC back and make another one, right? Or if, along the same lines of using meta to get a light and dark into the grave fast, it's also really important because it lets you get DMOC off of the field. It lets you get DMOC off the field and into your removed section, so you can bring it back with Dimension Fusion, which is really, really important because otherwise you'll have to wait for your opponent to get rid of DMOC, but you don't really want to be working around your opponent. You want to be making proactive plays with this deck. So that's one way, or you tribute DMOC for like Jinzo or Air Knight, right? But this is just better, right? Because it gets it off the field, it gets your Gatling Dragon out, which is 2600. It's also dark, which is good for your Chaos monsters. And there's just multiple games where like I have 2, maybe even 3 metas in hand, and like I'm glad that I have them in my hand and they're not dead because I'm playing Sinister Serpent and other cards that I can use it with. So that's the metas. Another card choice that I want to explain is Fusilier. I think that you have to play this card for more than one reason. First of all, the deck doesn't have too many normal summonable monsters, which again you need for Monster Gate to tribute. If you're not playing this, then you just have your Sacred Cranes and your Sinister if you're choosing to play this. But this card is normal summonable. You don't have to tribute for it, even though it's 7 stars. You can normal summon it, and its attack and defense become half. So that's just already a huge plus that you can normal summon it. It's a dark, obviously. And then you can meta it for King Dragoon, which is a really good card against Chaos decks and Chaos Turbo because they can't out it with things like Raigeki Break, Phoenix Swing, Wind Blast, Chaos Sorcerer, Raigeki Break, Ring of Destruction. There's so many cards that they can't out it with, and really their only outs to this are Torrential Tribute, Mirror Force, and Trap Infecting Virus if they're playing that, or if they're playing DD Warrior Lady, then they can out that with this. They can out this with that as well. But King Dragoon just puts in so much work against Chaos decks because it's 24, so they can't run it over with Chaos Sorcerer. They can't banish it with Chaos Sorcerer, and you could just fucking go in with King Dragoon. And then you don't make it that often, but you can play Last Warrior, which is a sick card against actually the mirror match. It's an option because it's also level 7, but if you're playing the mirror match and you make this and your opponent takes it with Snatch Steal, then that's like pretty crippling. So you just have to be careful with this card. But so that's a reason to play Fusilier. But the other really important reason to play this is because it has 2800 attack, and DMOC also has 2800 attack. Usually when you're going for game with this deck, you're going to be wanting to try to bring back Jinzo with Dimension Fusion to shut off your opponent's traps, and you're also going to be bringing back Dark Magician of Chaos most cases. So that's 28 plus 24, which is 5200 attack, plus 28 from Fusilier, which is 8000. So it's a clean 8000. I can't like stress how important enough it is that it's 2800 attack, not 27, not 26. It's a clean 8000, and a lot of times that's exactly how you're going to win with Jinzo, Fusilier, and DMOC. So I think this card is really important. That about covers the different card choices. Oh, maybe the last one, Monster Reincarnation. I know some people don't play this card, but I think it's really, really important. Um, because you need your Chaos Monsters for your combo. And this just gets them back from the grave, and you can get this back with Diamok, obviously. It also helps you manipulate your grave again by discarding a light and dark if you need it. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the ratios in this deck. There are a lot of different opinions about how many of each card and each level to play in this deck. Some people play very, very low monster count, like just, maybe 4, maybe even 3. Some people play 5, some people play 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? It's all about preference and personal play style. So I only play 7 normal summonable monsters, and I think no matter how many you're playing, the main thing to take into consideration is how many light targets you're playing. I like to play an even ratio of light to dark in terms of my normal summonable monsters. So I've got 3 darks here and then 3 lights. And you basically just want your chaos monsters to be live as much as possible and not dead. And I think having this even ratio helps with that. I mentioned earlier that Chaos Sorcerer does get skipped over by Monster Gate and Reasoning, and you'll have these in your graveyard, and so does Black Luster Soldier. So you're more likely to have dark targets in the grave, and also because you'll be making you'll be making Thousand Eyes with Metamorphosis. So in general, it's easier to get darks in the grave with this deck, but you really want to be banishing like the monsters that could be brought back with Dimension Fusion for your Chaos monsters. Like, it's suboptimal to banish your Thousand Eyes or a Chaos Sorcerer that has not been properly summoned for your Chaos monster, because you won't get them back with Dimension Fusion. So yeah, that's why I think it's pretty important to play even ratio of light and dark. Yeah, so that about covers the different card choices. I've already covered some of the pros and cons, but I will start talking about the pros and cons now. Like I mentioned earlier, it's an OTK deck. Like, this deck can win on like turn 2, like just straight up, and that does happen a decent amount of time. Maybe probably less than 10%, maybe 10% of the time, maybe 20% of the time, but it's very satisfying when that happens. I already mentioned that this deck has access to all the fun and relevant fusion cards in GOAT format, so that's another reason to play this deck. This deck also, I think, has the highest capacity for breaking boards. I think it breaks boards better than any other deck in GOAT format, and I think it has the potential to play out of the most the largest amount of different tough situations in comparison to other GOAT decks. Like, the number of boards I break with this and the different situations I've climbed out of, this deck is insane. And that's because, first of all, you're running heavy into True Nades, so you can play through 5 traps, right? Like, they're going to need a Solemn Judgment for every one of these. If you have 2 True Nades, they're going to need at least 2 Solemn Judgments on their field. Otherwise, you're going to break their board. So it plays through spells and traps easily. You're playing Lightning Vortex, so you can instantly clear their board, and you can just tutor out Lightning Vortex from your grave with Diamok. Another tip about Lightning Vortex in particular is that a lot of the times his opponent will let your Dimension Fusion go through because they'll have some banish cards. Like, if they're playing a Chaos deck, they might have 2, 3, or 4 banish cards, and they'll just let your Dimension Fusion go through because they think that they're safe, because they'll have multiple bodies on the field to block your attacks. But then you could just Lightning Vortex your entire field, and then you're fucked, right? So that's another just a little part about Lightning Vortex. And then I mentioned before, you're playing the Gatling Dragons with a Diamok, so you can just blow up their whole field. You can also bring out Ryu Senshi to get around traps. You can bring out Balter or Fiend Skull to get around flip effects or monster effects. And yeah, and you're playing Jinzo to shut off traps. So the deck just it's insane the types of situations it gets out of and how much it can come back with just a single card, Dimension Fusion. Like if you Dimension Fusion for Demock and Crane, you're drawing a card off of Crane and getting any spell in your graveyard, maybe a Pot of Greed. So that's insane. You're going like +3. Or sorry, you're actually getting 1, 2 cards right there. So that's already +1, plus another 1, 2, 3. Like that's already like a +4 right there off of just Dimension Fusion. So the deck can come back from anything. Let's see here. Another pro of this deck is that it makes a lot of decks will play Nobleman of Crossout, and this deck you don't really set, so it makes your opponent have 2 dead cards in their deck because most decks play 2 Noblemen. And it also makes things like Heavy Storm, Trunade, Mystical Space Typhoon pretty dead, since you're not really running too many traps or setting too often. And then I think the final pro of this deck is that contrary to popular belief, like this deck gets a lot of hate for being sacky, and people think that the deck is just autopilot and you don't really have to think too much to win with this deck. And while it is true that you can win with this deck without really needing to think if you just open like Broken, but like in a lot of games you're gonna have to think pretty hard about the sequence that you use your cards in, when you choose to use what cards, when to fire off your monster gates or reasonings. And like I said, this deck is basically like Spell Toolbox and Fusion Toolbox. That's another way to look at this deck. So you'll have many times where you have to choose very carefully what spell you get back from your graveyard or what fusion you want to make in that particular moment. Like you might have Pot of Greed and Graceful in your deck, and do you want to get those back, or do you want to get your Dimension Fusion back, or do you want to get your Lightning Vortex back, or Metamorphosis, right, or another Monster Gate or Reasoning? And it really depends on what's in your graveyard, what's in your hand, how many cards are left in your deck, right? If you know you have multiple outs in your deck left, then maybe you just want to dig deep with Graceful Charity or Pot of Greed. But there's a lot of really like micro decisions that you have to make with this deck, and each one of those decisions is like make or break it. Like people think that this deck doesn't take skill, but there's a lot of different paths of play or play sequences that you can make with this deck, and it's really critical the decisions that you make at each point in those sequences. So that's actually the reason I enjoy this deck the most, because you really do have to think a lot about like when you want to push, when you want to play passively, when you want to go for the OTK. Yeah, I just think it's very fun to play, and every game is, you know, pretty different when you compare it to something like Warriors, which is a pretty consistent deck, and you're pretty much playing the same game like every game you play, which is like Summon Blade Knight set 4, set whatever, set 3, or Summon Kaiku, right? So that's a pro of this deck, and it's also a con of this deck. Obviously, if you're playing this deck in like bigger tournaments with, you know, multiple rounds, 5, 6, 7, 8 rounds, then it could get very taxing to play this deck and tiring, since like you're gonna have to think so much and you're gonna just get tired, right? And then also just due to the variability of the deck, like in longer tournaments like that, it's probably best to play a deck that's 1, consistent, but 2, doesn't take too much thought, such that you can go with more or less the same game plan every time, and that might be better in bigger tournaments. But again, like for that exact same reason, this deck is really flexible, and like I said, can play out of different situations. So it's a pro and con of the deck, really. Other cons of the deck that I really want to call out. This deck can brick. It's kind of what this deck is known for. That's why I don't run too many monsters, too many high level monsters, because I don't want to brick. That's why I play the Sinister Serpent, because it helps with that as well. But yeah, this deck can brick. For me, I don't really brick too often with this build, to be honest. I'll brick maybe maybe like one out of maybe 1 out of 5 games or something like that. Like I'll brick for a turn or two. But then the games where I brick and lose, it's even less than that. Like often I won't have too much to do on the first or the second turn, but I end up still winning with this deck. So this deck can brick. Like I said, it's very delicate and fragile to Delinquent Duo. There obviously is an RNG or random component to this deck because of Monster Gate and Reasoning. I will talk about some tips and tricks for how to use these cards effectively to like minimize the risk, or like the risk in the fact that these are a little bit random, but there is some randomness and variability to the deck. There are limited side deck options for this deck. I'll talk more about the side deck later, but there's limited options for this deck because you don't really have too much flexibility in the monsters you can play, right? First of all, you want lights and darks for your chaos monsters, and then it's also very important, like the ratios of the different levels you're playing, right? Like you can see I'm playing 2 Cranes and not 3 Cranes. A lot of people play 3, but then you're playing 3 level 4s, which means you have 3 times the chance to hit level 4 than any of these other monsters, which means that your opponent is a lot more likely to call correctly with Reasoning, right? And for the same reason, you can't play too many other monsters in your side deck because it kind of messes up the effectiveness of Monster Gate and Reasoning and your chaos monsters. I mentioned earlier this deck has problems with face downs. And then finally, another con of playing this deck is that there are some very, very powerful side deck cards that other people can play that cripple this deck pretty hard. So you just have to be aware of them and know how to side against those cards. I'd say some of the more like potent ones to play against this deck like what is it called? The Cursed Seal, this card. Luckily not too many people side deck this card. Some do, but it's really good. It's a counter trap, and when your opponent activates a spell, you can discard any card, negate the activation, and destroy it. And for the rest of the duel, your opponent cannot use that spell card anymore. So this is really, really good. They can use it on your Dimension Fusion, Monster Gate, Reasoning, and you're already in a really tough position if they use it on any one of those. And it can also just negate any spell card. So they can negate your power cards like Graceful or Pot, which hurt Heavy Storm. It's like a really freaking good card. And it's really good in Chaos decks because they have the discard fodder for this one. And I really feel like more people should be playing this. But yeah. Oh, sorry. Quick correction. You have to discard a spell card for this card. So ignore what I said about Chaos. You have to discard a spell card to activate this. So you will have to discard one of your own spells. I was thinking about the second card, which is also really good against this deck, Magic Jammer, where you can discard any card. So a lot of times Chaos or Chaos Turbo will side this card because they have a lot of discard fodder, and that hurts this deck a lot too, obviously because you're running a lot of spells and because it's a counter trap. So spell speed 3. So those 2 cards really hurt this deck. Luckily, they're not super common side deck choices. Magic Jammer is a little bit more common, but other common side deck choices and even main deck, like a lot of people main deck Kaiku today in like 2 or 3, and this card really hurts the deck because it's just good against Chaos decks or decks that use Chaos monsters. It can remove your light and dark targets to make your Chaos monsters dead, which actually, pro tip, if you're playing against Reasoning Gate and you're using Kaiku, you really have to think about whether or not to use its effect to banish, because you're making their Dimension Fusion live if you banish things. So it's a trade-off. In most cases, I would say like you don't want to banish, because if you banish a Crane or a Jinzo and your opponent uses Dimension Fusion, like you're going to be in a bad spot. So I think just having this card on the field is enough to put you in a good spot, because it stops your opponents from summoning Chaos monsters because they cannot banish from their graveyard. or either graveyard. So Kaiku is really good against this deck. Another card that's really good against this deck, Spell Canceller. This card is very crippling for this deck. It is 5 stars, so you have to tribute for it, which makes it a little bit harder to get out. But it negates all spells. Like, you just can't use spells at all. So it shuts off, like, 80% of your deck, or 90% of your deck, whatever. So you have to be prepared for this card, because a lot of people will side this against you. Another card that, honestly, I feel like it should be played more, but a lot of people don't play it, and I don't really understand why. Jowgen, or some people play it, but I think it should be played more. This card is so good against this deck. You can discard a random card to destroy all special summon monsters on the field. This effect is insane. You can also, neither player can special summon, so if you just sit on this card, then the Reasoning Gate player can't special summon at all. So they can't use Meta, they can't use Monster Gate, Reasoning, Dimension Fusion. They just can't special summon. They can't summon their Chaos monsters. It's really good. And then another reason why this card is so good against this deck is because you can break your opponent's board instantly. Like, when you go for game with this deck, usually all of your monsters on your field will be special summoned monsters. So you can just summon Jowgen, call priority, blow up their entire field, and then put them in a really bad position. On top of that, it's light, so it's even better in Chaos decks. If a Chaos deck gets out a Jowgen and a Kaiku, it's going to be really, really hard to play through that. And then finally, the last card I'll mention is King Tiger Wengu. Some people side this. I don't see it that often, but it's really good against this deck, or pretty good against this deck, because it stops your Secret tokens. It obviously stops Thousand Eyes, and yeah, it just makes it a little bit harder to play this deck. But I'd say the cards I went through before, Magic Jammer, Curse of the Forbidden Spell, Spell Canceller, Kaiku, and Jowgen are a lot stronger against Reasoning Gate decks. Now I'll go into my side deck. I already mentioned that it's kind of hard to side monsters into this deck just because of like the nature of how the cards work. But you do play Spell Canceller for the mirror match or empty jar decks or other decks that use a lot of spells. It's pretty solid because it's level 5, and you could just pull it out with Monster Gate or Reasoning. And if you get out first or second turn, you're like in a really good position against in the mirror match or other spell heavy decks. I'm playing one Death Wombat against burn decks. It's good because it's level 3, which you're not playing any of, so it doesn't mess up your level ratios. And it's 1600, which is pretty good stats. I'm playing 1 Swords and 2 Messengers. Swords it's a good card. Like, it's like just getting 3 turns to draw into your combo pieces is really good. And then it's also really good because you can bounce it back with Giant Grenade and reset it. And it's also good in some situations where you want to flip your opponent's face down to make it so that you can blow it up with Lightning Vortex. That's like kind of a specific play, but just a tip right there. Messenger of Peace is it has like some of the most natural synergy with this deck. Against more aggro decks like Warrior that put on pressure turn 1, you want a way to stall against those decks and live long enough to see your combo pieces. And this makes it so that any monster with 1500 or more attack cannot attack, including your own. But every standby phase, you get to choose whether or not to keep this card active or destroy it. You only need to pay 100, so this is like nothing. This is basically like 0 life points. This is like a negligible amount of life points to pay. Even if you leave this card on the field for 10 turns, which doesn't happen that often, that's only 1000 life points, right? And the most important part about this card in comparison to other stall cards like Gravity Bind or Level Limit Area B is that you get to choose exactly when to shut this card off and get rid of it. So you can draw, and then based on what you draw, you can decide if you want to leave this card on the field or not, which is it's insane. Because if you draw your combo piece, then you can say, okay, I'm just gonna get rid of this, and now I can attack for game. If you don't draw your combo piece, you just leave it on the field and keep going on, which is nice. I'm playing two Noblemen of Crossout. I side it in against Chaos decks or Flip Control decks. Like I said before, this card is kind of tricky because it makes Dimension Fusion live for your opponents as well, which really kind of sucks. But a lot of times you just need that face down, like off the field, to prevent your opponent from snowballing, and then maybe you can Lightning Vortex if they bring it back with Dimension Fusion. But I'm considering playing Mind Control instead of Nobleman because Mind Control, it serves the same purpose of getting the monster off of their field, which is nice. It's usable against more than just face down monsters, obviously. You can use your opponent's flip effects yourself. I don't like it because you obviously can't attack with that monster. You can't tribute it for anything. And sometimes this deck needs all 5 monster zones for the OTK, and you don't have space for their card on your side of the field. So I need to test this more, but I might side this. But Nobleman has been working out pretty well for when you're going second. I'm playing Torrential, Mirror Force, and Ring of Destruction. These cards are in here because a lot of people, like I said, like to side Spell Canceller against this deck. So you need to have outs for Spell Canceller, and these are your outs to that. Torrential also just good against control decks that are playing Scapegoat. Mirror Force good against aggro decks. Ring of Destruction is just a versatile card. I don't play this in the main deck. Some people main deck this card instead, or main deck this card instead of siding it, and I don't play it because almost every time I win, I end on Jinzo on my board, and that shuts off your Ring of Destruction. And sometimes you don't know that the Jinzo is coming because you get it off of a Monster Gate or Reasoning, and then your Ring of Destruction is dead, right? Or it's not live. So like it's kind of harder to win with Ring for a game than you would think. And then also it just deals damage to your life points, which makes your Dimension Fusion harder to activate sometimes because you have to pay 2,000. Next, I'm playing Hollow Life Barrier. This is for the Mirror Match or other OTK decks, and it's also for burn decks because it stops you from taking any damage from your opponent. It also helps you manipulate cards in your graveyard. You can discard your Lights and Darks if you want, but I'm mostly playing this for OTK and burn decks. And then I play 3 Royal Decree. I usually side out some of these traps for the Royal Decrees. This is an interesting card to play, and you really have to decide when to put it in. Sometimes it can hurt you more, and you'll have to decide about whether to put in these decrees or to put in these other defensive traps. I'd say if your opponent is playing, the thing is like, the thing about like playing this deck is like you have to be prepared for what your opponent is going to side in against you, not just siding in against their deck. It's like a game of chess. You have to be like one step ahead of your opponent. So like your opponent might be playing warriors or chaos control, and they're playing a lot of traps, and you just think playing Royal Decree is a good idea, right? But you need to consider the fact that they're going to be siding in Kaikus if they don't main it. They're going to be putting in Jowgen, maybe King Targowangu, other monsters that you're going to need to have outs for. So you're going to need to put in these traps here, and Royal Decree is going to make it harder for you to use your own traps to out those cards. I usually only side in Royal Decree if I'm going first against those decks because it'll shut off all their traps immediately, and I already have a slight advantage because I'm going first. You usually don't want to put it in if you're going second, and you just want to be careful that it doesn't hurt you more than it hurts your opponent, right? Obviously it's good against burn or other trap heavy decks that really just need traps to win, but yeah, you have to be considering the monsters that your opponent's going to side in against you. So that is the side deck. I'm going to wrap it up with some tips and tricks for playing this deck, some general rules of thumb that might come up in different situations. I think the first thing to know about this deck is how to play it going first. You don't want to be just ripping your Monster Gates and Reasonings right off the bat. If you have multiple Monster Gates and multiple Reasonings or both in your hand, you generally want to hold them to the second turn or after and not just rip them off the bat. Because you're putting a monster in the field, you obviously can't attack first turn, and then you're putting the monster on the field and now it's susceptible to things like Snatch Steal or Thousand Eyes. Like if you drop an Air Knight and your opponent Snatch Steals it, like you're in a pretty bad position right there, because now you have to out it, now they're gaining advantage, etc. Your scapegoats are useless against Air Knight. And if they take your Jinzo, that also sucks, because you just don't have a Light and Dark in the Grave anymore for your Chaos monsters until they die, right? So you generally want to not just fire these off, but Sinister Serpent makes them a little bit better first turn, like I said before, so there's that. Another tip with this deck, when you summon Chaos Sorcerer and you have a Dimension Fusion in your hand, you're going to have a choice whether or not to use the priority on the Chaos Sorcerer or not. Oftentimes, I do not use the priority on the Chaos Sorcerer, because if I do it, they're going to get back their monster anyway when I use Dimension Fusion. So I'll wait till after I use Dimension Fusion to banish their monster. Not calling priority gives your opponent a window to do something here. Like they can Raigeki Break or Ring of Destruction your Chaos Sorcerer, but that's usually not the biggest deal, because you're gonna have the Dimension Fusion follow play, and if they Torrential Tribute, then they're just blowing up their own field, so that's totally fine. Another tip, let's see here, along the same lines, you're gonna want to Noble Man of Crossout like after you use Dimension Fusion, obviously, so they don't have the monsters that can get back. And then another thing that comes up pretty often is that with this deck, if you gotta keep in mind the cards that your opponent's gonna side in against you. If they have Kaiku in their deck, then it's gonna make it really hard for you to get your Chaos Sorcerer out and get your DMOC banished like you need it to be for Dimension Fusion. So you're generally going to want to get monsters banished as quickly as possible, like get your DMOC banished as quickly as possible, maybe even get your Chaos Sorcerer on the board as quickly as possible, just to make your Dimension Fusion live, because your opponent can win just with having a Kaiku in the field and just attacking you and not removing from play your cards. So yeah, you generally want to get things set up. Even if you're going first turn and there's no reason to drop the Chaos Sorcerer first turn, like if you can drop the Chaos Sorcerer and banish a DMOC and a Crane first turn, like you might need to do that, because they probably have a Kaiku in their hand, and if they drop the Kaiku on their first turn, then you're just not going to be able to do that like for the rest of the game. So that's a tip. And then a tip for playing against this deck, I already mentioned the one with Kaiku not banishing, but a lot of people don't realize that like sometimes it's good to leave the Scapegoat tokens on the field unless you can get rid of all of them in one turn. Like if you can only get rid of one Scapegoat token and leave your opponent with 3 tokens, like sometimes it's better to just leave them with all 4 tokens, because it gives them less space to bring monsters back to Dimension Fusion. There's a lot of games where I'll use Scapegoat and my opponent will attack 2 of them, and then I'll have 3 spots on the field, which gives me a spot for Chaos Sorcerer, a spot for DMOC, and a spot for Sacred Crane, and then I just win. Whereas if they left them on the field, I wouldn't be able to use Dimension Fusion, and I wouldn't have been able to win that turn. So a lot of people are confused when I ask them like if they want to attack the Scapegoat, because they think it's very obvious to just attack tokens whenever you possibly can. But it's just something to think about when you're playing against this deck. That's pretty much it. Let me know what you guys think. I'll probably have in separate videos replays of myself playing this deck. But this was just meant to be like an overview of the deck, and also kind of like an in-depth analysis, explanation, tutorial of how to play the deck and how to play against the deck. So yeah, thanks for watching.